although it's not very sunny out right now. Here we are at Jockey Hollow. What town is this? Hold on. We are here. Where are we? Hold on. Here we are at Jockey Hollow. I'm so excited. We're gonna tour around, look around a bit, and see if we can find any ghosts. Go! My glasses. So here we are inside an old house at Jockey Hollow. Ooh, look at all the ghosts. Just kidding. Actually, I couldn't film at Jockey Hollow. I don't think they approve of filming there, so I didn't get the chance to do that. I did go in the Tempewick house. It was nice. It was exciting. I didn't see any ghosts either. But tonight, I'm going to read a little bit from my book, Lula Vanderhoof and the Monster Sleuth, 3 weeks later, by me, PBonasera. Chapter 1, A Big Mess. It was a bright summer morning, and the Vanderhoof funeral parlor was busy as ever. Lula Vanderhoof had just come downstairs with her rabbit Ghosty when she heard the doorbell ring. Ding dong. "Oh, hey Rio. Hey Sparky," she said happily after opening the door. "Come in." "I keep telling you, Lula, it's Barky, not Sparky," he said with a chuckle. "Sorry," said Lula. "Sometimes ghost messages aren't always clear. I'll remember next time." "So what's going on downstairs?" he asked. "Oh, you know, the usual," said Lula, straightening her black dress. "No, I mean, I heard someone scream, and then a woman ran out of the house," he replied. "Really? That's weird. Maybe we should go check it out," Lula said. "Yeah, we probably should. Let's go," Ria said excitedly. Living above a funeral parlor wasn't exactly average, and Lula was accustomed to noise coming from the first floor, but never screaming people running around. They were both very curious to see what this was all about. By the time they got down to the parlor, several people were outside. Everyone was frantic, and Lula and Rio knew something big was going on. Lula's father was trying to calm everyone down, and her mother was trying to pick up picture frames that had fallen off the tables. Vases of flowers and wreaths were knocked down and scattered on the floor. The room was a complete mess. "Mom, what happened?" Lula asked. Her mother... Oh, I messed up. "Mom, what happened?" Lula asked her mother as she began to help her pick up wreaths. "Oh dear, it was awful," said her mom. "It was like a big gust of wind. No, more like a mini tornado, and it came swishing through the room." "What was it?" asked Lula. Rio stood beside them along with Ghosty and Barky. I don't know," her mom replied nervously. They all finished picking the items up off the floor, and the crowd settled down. "Please, everyone, take your seats," Mike Vanderhoof, Lula's dad, said to the group. "I'm not sure what happened here. Did anyone see anything?" "Yes," one woman spoke up. "It was a twister." "Yeah," said another. "It just came right in and knocked everything down." A tall man with dark hair stood and said, "I think it was a ghoul." Everyone in the room gasped. Then there was silence. "We mustn't let our imaginations get the best of us now," her dad said. "Let's all try to relax." Rio and Lula looked at each other. They knew something was wrong. They left the room and went outside near a rose bush to talk. "Wow, what a mess," said Rio. "It sure is. What do you think it was?" Lula said. "Not sure, but I think we should find out," said Rio. "We?" Lula exclaimed. "Why we?" "Well, you did a pretty good job taking care of that troll a couple of weeks ago," said Rio, "and I figure if anybody could do it, it would be you. I mean, us?" Okay. Where do we start? I've never done detective work," replied Lula. "Well, now's our chance. Come on. I have an idea." Rio led Lula down the path and around the side of the house where the entrance of the parlor was, and started looking at the ground and in the bushes and around the edge of the hill by the house. They noticed that the grass had been trampled on and strewn about as if something very heavy had run through. There was nothing around. "Look over there!" Rio exclaimed. "The flower pots are shaking." All of the flower pots by the garden shed were jiggling and knocking into each other. "This is creepy," Lula said. "Yeah," said Rio, "it's awesome. We've got to go look inside that shed." Lula thought Rio had gone crazy. She didn't want him to go alone, and she didn't want to be left alone waiting for him either, so she followed. Rio walked quickly until he got closer, then he stopped. "What's wrong?" asked Lula. "Do you see something?" "No, I just thought I'd stop a minute," said Rio. "You're scared," said Lula. "No, I'm not," said Rio. "Anyway, look who's talking. I mean, you can see ghosts and you're still scared." "That's because ghosts aren't scary, Rio. And anyway, I'm not anymore." "Right," Rio said doubtfully. Lula and Rio had been friends for exactly 3 weeks, ever since the incident with the troll. He knew Lula was different than most kids, but now he was starting to really see just how different she is. Yes, she really did have a magic book, and yes, she really could do magic, but seeing ghosts and speaking to them, well, things were getting more and more interesting by the day. "Don't you see anything over there?" he asked her. The flower pots were still trembling a little, but Lula didn't see anything. Ghosty and Barky didn't even seem concerned. They were playing in the field together, romping about. "I guess we'll have to get closer," Lula replied, "if we really want to find something." "Okay, but we should go together just to be safe," Rio said. "Safety in pairs," remarked Lula. Chapter 2. Even the ghosts were scared. Lula and Rio crept closer to the shed. Barky and Ghosty were still chasing each other around the field. Ghost dog chasing ghost bunny, then ghost bunny chasing ghost dog. This could go on for hours. "Psst, guys," Lula whispered loudly, trying to get them to follow. They both perked up their little ghost ears and trotted along behind. The flower pot stopped jiggling. Everything was still. Rio peered into the window of the shed, but it was completely dark. "Lula, take a look. Maybe you can see something I can't," Rio said. Lula stood on top of an old brick trying to peek inside. "No, nothing. I don't see a thing. Not even a glimmer of a thing," she said. Suddenly, they were very brave and walked around to where the door was. Rio hesitated, then opened it very quickly. A huge gust of wind came rushing out and nearly pushed them over. It was too fast for Lula to see, but Barky and Ghosty were huddled together, shaking and holding on for dear life. "How's it even possible that ghosts can be frightened?" Lula said, looking at the two little spirits holding each other and shaking. "How is it that you're not?" replied Rio, who looked as if he had just seen a ghost himself. "Did you feel that wind? It was like hot air and it smelled like wet dog." That's funny. It does smell a little like wet dog," said Lula. "Look, there's a trail," said Rio, pointing at the trampled grass leading down the hill. "Why didn't you see it, Lula? If it was a ghost, shouldn't you have seen it?" "I guess it was too fast, or something," she said, confused. They followed the path of trampled grass, hoping to find something, but when they reached the driveway, it was gone. "It must have gone down the driveway," said Rio. "Or up," said Lula nervously, looking back at him. Uh-oh. That would mean it's going back to the parlor. They all ran back up toward the parlor, but everything was still. They stepped quietly inside. The mess seemed to be cleaned up, but no one was there. Everyone was gone. "Where is everyone?" asked Lula. "We weren't gone that long." "Upstairs," said Ghosty in his little ghost rabbit voice. "Ghosty says we should go upstairs," Lula announced, because she was the only one who could hear him. Rio looked at her, shook his head, and smiled. "Okay, I guess if Ghosty says so, then we should." The four of them slowly walked up the steps to the second floor where Lula lived with her parents. They heard a lot of people talking behind the door. Lula turned the knob and they entered the sitting room. The crowd that had been downstairs earlier was now gathered in her house. The four friends walked past the sitting room and into the kitchen. Lula poured Rio a glass of orange juice and sat down beside him at the kitchen table to drink hers. They listened to what the visitors were talking about in the other room. "Did you hear that growl?" one woman said. "It was just awful." "I did," said an older man standing beside her, "but I saw nothing, only a great wind that slammed the door shut." "Well, we're all safe now," said Lula's father. "I'm so sorry for the disturbance on this very sad day." Chapter 3. The Bell. Rio and Lula knew they had to do something. But what? Lula turned to her rabbit. "Ghosty, do you have any ideas?" "Oh, dearie dear, I have something to tell you," spoke a woman's voice from inside the kitchen. "Did you hear that, Rio?" asked Lula. "No, what?" he replied. Lula looked around. Right behind her was a ghost of a very sparkly old woman. "Oh, hello," said Lula. "Who are you?" "I'm here with my family," said the old lady, petting Barky. "They're all in the other room." "Oh, you must be the guest of honor, Mrs. Tabor. Why don't you go see them?" Lula asked with a smile. "Because I must tell you what I saw," replied the old lady ghost. "What is it, Lula?" asked Rio. Barky was sitting quietly while Mrs. Tabor pet him. Then Ghosty lay down next to him to be pet too. "It's the woman everyone is here to visit," said Lula. "Oh, wow," said Rio. "Is she a ghost?" "Shh," said Lula softly. "Yes." "Nice lady," said Ghosty. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Tabor. What do you need to tell me?" Lula asked. "Well, I was downstairs at the party," Mrs. Tabor began. "She said she was at the party. I mean, funeral," Lula whispered to Rio. Rio nodded. "When a big wind came, a huge dark cloud," Mrs. Tabor continued, "and it circled the room, knocking things over. Then the strangest thing happened, Lady Ghost." "She saw a big gray dog," said Lula to Rio. "I knew I smelled wet dog," Rio said excitedly. "What happened then?" "Well, I watched to see where it was going," said Mrs. Tabor. "It was as if I was being pulled along with it through the air. It ran to the shed in your backyard, then back through the parlor." "Did you see anything after that?" Lula asked. "Everyone ran upstairs, so I drifted up with them. But I did notice one thing," said Mrs. Tabor. "The big dog spirit grabbed a bell from the table near my casket." "A bell? What kind of bell?" asked Lula. "What's going on, Lula? Come on, tell me," Rio begged. "Sorry, Rio, I keep forgetting you can't hear her. She said the ghost dog grabbed a bell from the small table near her. I mean, the old her." "Oh, wow," replied Rio. "Hey, ask her if the bell was hers." "Mrs. Tabor, was it your bell?" asked Lula. The old woman thought for a moment. She thought about her life and what had happened before she became a ghost. She tried to remember. "I think," she said and hesitated, "I think I once had a big gray dog." "If you had a dog that looked just like the spirit one that ran in and knocked everything down, then it must be your dog," exclaimed Lula. Whoa, remarked Rio. This is nuts. What was your dog's name? She asked Mrs. Tabor. He was a very, very big dog, a wolfhound. In fact, his name was Wolf. When he was outside, I would have to ring the bell to call him, or he wouldn't come in. Oh, so I wonder if someone rang the bell, and that's why he came running, said Lula. I think you're right, Mrs. Tabor said. I remember now that a friend of mine brought the bell in wrapped in cloth, and when he was done speaking, took it out, rang it 2 times, and placed it in on the little table next to the old me. That's when Wolf sped into the room, knocking everything over. No one could see him. They only felt the wind. I hadn't seen him in 35 years. He must have been so excited to see you after all that time, said Lula. Oh, he was. That is why he made such a mess, running through, knocking everything over, Mrs. Tabor said. He certainly didn't mean to cause any trouble. I wonder why he stole the bell and ran off with it again, said Lula. Maybe he didn't steal it on purpose. Maybe he was frightened by all the screaming people and ran off with it by mistake, said Rio. Yes, said Mrs. Tabor to Lula. There certainly was a lot of commotion, and poor Wolf just wanted to play. So the visitors were scared off by Wolf's ghost, and he was scared of their noise, said Lula. Poor thing. Oh dear, poor Wolf. He must feel so alone, Mrs. Tabor said sadly. Well, I guess we better find him, said Lula. I think we need the bell to do that, remarked Rio. Right, and that's going to be tough. It could be anywhere. What does it look like, Mrs. Tabor? Questioned Lula. It is small and silver and has a little purple gem on the handle. His trainer gave it to me when he was a puppy. He's a purebred show dog. Okay, well, we'll get started looking for the bell. Everyone wait here. I'll be right back, Lula said, and ran upstairs to her room. She grabbed her satchel and stuffed it with everything she'd need in case she had to do a spell. Her magic book, a pair of scissors, some stuffing, scrap material, thread, needles, and markers. Chapter 4. The Forest. As soon as she was back, Ghosty began to tug at her hand. What is it, Ghosty? Said Lula. Look, he replied, and he pointed at Barky, who was sniffing at the ground. He's leading us to the bell, said Lula. Barky, take us to the bell, Lula commanded. The little ghost dog sniffed at the ground, zigging from right to left to right, trying to keep track of the path Wolf took. Barky's 3 friends followed close behind as he led them back downstairs and out the door. He led them back to the shed and around the bend. Barky's retracing Wolf's paw steps, said Rio. They kept on walking, Barky leading, then Ghosty and Lula and Rio following. He's headed toward the woods, Lula announced. I don't think we should go. If we don't go, we may never find the bell, said Rio. In a couple of hours, it'll be nighttime, said Lula. What if we get lost? They stood in line, side by side, trying to decide. It was still pretty bright out, but they looked into the darkness from the edge of the woods. There were so many trees that the light did not shine through. They were afraid to enter. They were afraid of the dark. And most of all, they were afraid of what they might find. Lula's parents told her never to go into the woods without a grown-up. They said something lived in the woods, some very scary thing. What if we run into that monster my parents told me about, Lula said nervously. Oh, bunk, said Rio. That's just an old legend to scare you into staying away from the woods so you don't get lost. Well, it worked, said Lula. And who says monsters are bunk? That troll was a monster. Yeah, and everything turned out okay then, right? Rio reminded her. Yes, it did, she agreed reluctantly. You want to stay here, but I'm going, he replied. There was a long pause. No one moved. They barely breathed. Suddenly, Rio began to walk ahead. He didn't have a plan or know where he was going, but he marched forward, realizing that if he went first, his friends would have to follow. And they did. Barky finally took the lead again, then Lula, and Ghosty, with Rio at the end, just as he had planned. Chapter 5. I See Them. Once they were in the forest, it was darker, but not as dark as expected, and they could still see where they were headed. "We should leave markers so that we can find our way back," said Lula. "Won't you need the markers for doing spells?" asked Rio. "Not the drawing markers, silly. Some kind of small trail of paper or something," Lula replied. "You know, like they did with the breadcrumbs in Hansel and Gretel." "Oh," giggled Rio, a bit embarrassed. "Sure, I have a magazine in my backpack we can tear up and crumple into balls." "Great idea," said Lula, "and it won't be littering since we'll pick them up on the way back." Rio took the magazine out of his bag and the two friends started tearing out pages and smushing them into balls. They filled up Rio's pack with as many as they could and saved the rest of the magazine for later, or in case they got lost and needed it for campfire. "Okay, Barky, I think we're ready," said Rio to his invisible dog. Barky began to sniff the ground again and moved ahead. The others followed, leaving a trail of paper balls behind. They walked further and further into the woods. The light from the outside was dimming and they could no longer see where the forest began. "Do you think it will get much darker?" Lula asked nervously. "Nah, not much," replied Rio, "but I wonder how much further we need to go." "I hear," said Ghosty gently and grabbed Lula's hand. "No be 'fraid." "Thank you, Ghosty," she said, feeling the soft feather-like tickle of his little ghost paw. "So why do you always wear black?" Rio asked as they walked. "That's a weird question," said Lula, taken off guard. "I mean, it might be easier to see you in the dark if you were wearing something brighter," he said. "I like black," she replied cheerfully. "Isn't it a little morbid?" he asked. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "You know, depressing. Like death," he continued. "I live over a funeral parlor, silly. Nothing depresses me," Lula stated. "Anyway, I read in my painting book that black is all colors mixed together, and that sounds quite happy to me." "In science class we learned that black is the absence of light, and that's why everything looks black in the dark," said Rio. "Just like it's starting to right now." "Are you scared again?" asked Lula with a sigh. "Of course not," said Rio. "Why would I be scared of the dark? Look at those little moving lights up ahead. What are those anyway?" That's when Rio saw them. In the darkening wood he began to see a faint outline of the two ghosts. "What?" "I see them," he replied. "Who?" she asked. "I can't believe it." "I see Barky and Ghosty," said Rio. "Finally," she said. "See, I told you they were real. I wonder why you never saw them before." "Maybe it's the dark. But I've been in the dark before," he realized. "Maybe it's the type of dark. Maybe it's just the right amount of dark," Lula said. "I think you're right," said Rio. "They look so sparkly, like a little outline of stars." "To me they are more like shimmery clouded shapes," said Lula. "It's so cool," he said. Rio didn't say it, but he wanted to grab Barky and hug him. He had missed his little dog so much, but now it was like he didn't lose him at all. Chapter 6. Something Behind the Wall. "Maybe it'll be easier to find Wolf now," he said, clearing his voice and changing the subject. He didn't want to get all emotional, especially in front of a girl. "You might be right, but I couldn't even see Wolf. What if he's just too fast for us to see at all?" Lula worried. "Let's keep going," said Rio. Barky seemed fearless as he led them through the woods. But he couldn't help himself, really. It was just his instincts, and he needed to follow the scent. Faster and faster he went as he sniffed furiously at the ground. The others trampled behind, trying to keep up. He sniffed and snarled and ran all at once, and then, suddenly, he stopped. Barky began shivering, his little ghost dog body trembling in fear. "Barky, what's wrong?" asked Lula. "Shh," said Ghosty, his voice sounding like a light breeze. Then Barky stood really still. His small, transparent nose pointed directly at an old stone wall. Again, the four friends stood side by side in a row. No one said a word. "Wait," said Ghosty. He floated up higher and higher he went until he was just above the stone wall. He looked around from above, then floated back to his friends on the ground. "It is a way," he said. "What is a way?" Lula asked. "The Hornhogan. The Hornhogan is a way," he replied. "What is a Hornhogan?" asked Lula. "A Hornhogan!" exclaimed Rio. "Shh," said Lula. "A Hornhogan," whispered Rio, "is a giant ogre lady. She lives in the woods and eats children. I read about her in my monster manual that I got for Christmas last year." "That is so creepy," said Lula. "I wish you had your manual with you so we could figure out what to do if we see her." "I wish I could remember what to do." "Does it say anything in your magic book?" he asked. "Let me see," she replied. "I think we should find a better place to sit before we look through the book." I think we've read about half the book tonight, and maybe tomorrow I'll finish the book for you. Okay, well, thanks for joining me again here in the castle. And if you're interested in buying my book, you could go to Amazon.com and look up Lula Vanderhoof and the Monster Sleuths, Book 2, 3 weeks later. But, you know, there's always time to hear me read.